Um, so yeah, I'm Chen Yang. I was an NUS alumni. Back I graduated in 2017, and I've been with Snapchat for like almost 3 years now, as a security engineer. And I'm in the application security team for Snapchat. And what I do mostly is to work on security tooling, as well as like to review new features or products that Snapchat would have. So before I start, as a disclaimer, my views in this presentation are solely my own and does not represent, my views or the views or opinion of my employer. Yeah, so I'll be talking about log4j, or it should be actually pronounced as log4j, but most people just pronounce it as log4j. And so what is log4j? Log4j is a open source package for Java that is used for logging, as the name suggests. And it's actually used by a lot of applications, including Minecraft servers, and stuff like Elasticsearch and stuff like that. And it has a lot of features, and it allows for like plugins to extend, the framework to include even more features. And so the talk is mostly about log4 shell, which is a series of vulnerabilities that affects log4j. And why is log4 shell so dangerous? So for many Java code bases, log4j is a very commonly used dependency. And even if a code base doesn't use log4j, one of its dependency in the code base might be using log4j. And according to Google, a lot of packages on Maven Central is actually using log4j, right? Like 8% of them. And this is in contrast to like the average of like 2% of packages that are typically affected by like a vulnerability, right? And the median is actually only like 0.1% of packages are typically affected by like a vulnerability in Java. And so that 8% is an astronomical number here. And not just that, right? Like log4 shell is exploitable in the default configuration for log4j. So when you install and you use the package, that is vulnerable by default already, right? And even the most basic usage of it is vulnerable to log4 shell. Like in this case, like just logging a user agent would result in you being vulnerable, right? And so like what's the impact here, right? Like if you're vulnerable, depending on your Java environment or version of Java that you're running, you could potentially be vulnerable to remote code execution that is super easily achieved, right? Like in this sample payload, this is all it takes to really exploit the vulnerability here, right? And even if remote code execution is not possible, you could still exploit the vulnerability to exfiltrate information about the system from the environment variables and whatnot, right? It's super easy to exploit, and it affects a lot of systems, right? So let's look at how the vulnerability, or rather the exploit, works. So this diagram is created by I believe the Swiss CERT team. And if we look at the start, the attacker would just make a request to like a vulnerable server with a payload in the user agent, and the vulnerable server might just log the user agent as part of this logging. And while doing that, it is actually being exploited, and then it makes that while logging, it actually triggers this JNDI module, which is I believe called Java Naming and Directory Interface, and it makes a ldap request to that URL that you provide in your payload. And so then that vulnerable server makes a URL request, ldap request to that host that you provide to it, and it fetches and the malicious server can provide like a response to the request that then causes the vulnerable server to fetch a malicious Java class. And once it fetches that Java class, it will execute it, and it could then run whatever Java command or code that is in that Java class. So yeah, the whole exploitation flow here is not like super complicated. It's super easy to exploit. It's super easy to test if a service is vulnerable, and there's many areas where you could potentially input your payload that could potentially be logged on the server side. So let's look at the timeline, for the entire issue, right? So like I think it started earlier than December 10. I believe like December 4th was when the researcher first reported the issue. But on December 10 was when the first CVE was assigned, and it has a severity of 10, which is the maximum. And only on December 11 did they release like a patch. And in a couple of days, a new CVE was assigned, a new vulnerability was found, and this continued, for a couple of days until like December 28th. And we'll talk more about each of them later. But yeah, let's dive into the first patch and look at what they fixed here. So in patch 2.15, they basically removed the ability to do a lookup. And so the lookup is necessary for you to make that JNDI request. And so they removed that ability to do it from like, your log message. And then they also restricted JNDI connections to only just localhost servers, right? But then having said that, you could still do like a lookup, but then you would need to be in your logging configuration, which is not uncommon. There are like instances of services that were logging certain contexts in their configuration that could still be vulnerable. So yeah, so then the second CVE was about making a lookup in the configuration, and initially it was just resulting in a denial of service because you could only make a request to localhost, right? So it is not common for if an attacker has control of a localhost server, they would already be in your system, right? So then the impact is actually kind of low here, right? Because you make a lookup to a localhost server, and while doing that, you consume some resource, either socket resource or like you take up some time on that CPU, which results in a denial of service, right? But then we know that this was eventually bypassable. So let's look at the code, the actual code that was implemented in the patch, right? So here we see that in the patch they do a very simple allow list for the host, and then if we dive deeper into how they are passing their host name, right? We go into the code for how the URI is being passed, right? And we can look at this specific part where I've highlighted with the red box, and you can see like they are basically trying to pass a URL into that graph format, right? But then if we look at how a ldap URL is being passed, we can start to see differences here. So this is how the ldap URL is being passed. And I don't know if you have noticed the difference, but there is a slight difference. I'm going to put them side by side, so it's easier to notice. Yeah, I'll give you like 5 seconds to try to find what's the difference here, but it should be pretty obvious like this. Yeah, so if you haven't noticed, the difference here is really just the fragment part of it. So in typical Java URI, they expect a fragment in the URL, but in ldap URL, they don't expect a fragment in there. So like there is a difference in how they're passing the URL. And what this means is that you could have one URL that results in 2 different host names, right? So as we can see in this example, firstly, we try to pass it using the Java URI object. And secondly, we try to pass it as if like it's an ldap URL. And from the output, we can see that the Java URI is returning the local host value as a host name, whereas in the ldap section, it's actually trying to make a request to the entire host name, including that fragment character in it, right? So basically, this would result in us being able to bypass the localhost restriction that was added in that patch, right? So now, from a very simple denial of service, you can now escalate it into like a remote code execution again, right? So this is the second remote code execution in like 5 days now, I believe. And like all the teams have already patched it once the first time, right? So now we have to reactivate everyone. Hey, like the patch is insufficient. All of you have to patch again. You wake them up at like 12 a.m. in the night. Start rushing to patch everything again. So it's not great, right? But yeah, I mean, so while everybody's rushing to patch, we have the the SOC team or the detection and response team that are trying to do some threat hunting to try to find services or servers that might be vulnerable or like exploited by this issue, right? So back to this diagram, it very conveniently helps you identify like areas that you could be looking for potential compromise. Like in the spots that are labeled 1, you could look at logs to try to identify if someone's trying to scan your services from an external point of view to check if it's vulnerable. And then at parts that are labeled 2, you could look for services that are making requests to fetch malicious or rather making requests to malicious servers to attempt to retrieve the malicious Java class. And at step 3, you could look for post compromise artifacts or like evidence of compromise on these like vulnerable machines, right? But let's focus on step 2. So I'm going to propose like a very generic strategy, but like if you think about it, if we can find services that are making DNS requests or DNS lookups to malicious or suspicious host names, that could allow us to strategize and focus our efforts on patching these services, or like looking into them, analyzing them first over like others that are maybe less critical at the time. Again, we are like in a very rush for time. Like everybody's rushing. We have been awake for a while now. We are just like trying to prioritize like what we can do and what's important to do ahead of like things that are less important, right? So yeah, so the story here is that we found that a couple of services were making DNS lookups to really suspicious looking domains like web collaborators and stuff, right? However, these services don't seem to be vulnerable to log4shell. They don't seem to be running log4j, even some of them. So it's really suspicious why they are doing this DNS lookups, right? Yeah, but for people who are familiar with Java, you might know the answer, right? But for most of us, I don't think we would know why it could be doing this, right? But apparently it's a very common thing to know about. But basically, when you put a URL object into a hash table in Java, it actually makes a DNS lookup request. Yeah, so some of you are like confused now, like why would they do that, right? Like why would you make a DNS lookup, but the reason behind it is not insane, right? It's not crazy if you think about it. But basically, how hash tables have keys, right? And keys are meant to be distinct, unique, right? So if I give you 2 URLs, I give you 2 domains, how do you know that they are resolved to the same IP address without doing a DNS lookup? Right? There's just no way that you can tell from a URL whether it resolves to localhost or whether it resolves to 8.8.8.8 or something, right? Without doing a resolution. And so I believe that was the rationale behind it. They did a resolution, and then using the IP that was resolved, they tried to insert into the hash table. So yeah, that was like almost the end of my content here. I do have some bonus content, but I think we can stop and start to think a little about what we can take away from here. But basically, one question that is typically asked after something like that is like, how do we prevent an incident like this from happening again, right? Like, how do we prevent log4j from or log4shell from happening again? But it's actually not a very straightforward answer, right? Like, there's no way. Number one, it's impossible to review every line of code that is running in production. There easily could be millions and millions of line of code, and there could be like dependencies that you don't control and stuff like that. So it's impossible to know everything that's running on your machines, right? And number two, do you even know all the machines that are running in your company? Can you confidently tell me the list of machines that you own and run in your company, right? I think that's a very difficult question as well. And then even then, even if you know the list of machines, do you know what they are running? Each and every individual machine, do you know what language they're running, what dependencies they have, what version of dependencies they're running, right? It's also a really difficult question. And then at the end of it, do you have logs for all of them? Like, do you have the same kind of logs? If you're doing detection and response, if you're doing threat hunting, do you have the same kind of logs for all of them, right? It's most of the time, the answer is no, right? So I think back to the original question, how do we prevent this from happening? I think the answer here is that it's not preventable. And the right approach here is not to try to prevent this, but the right approach here is to try to streamline the process of addressing such an incident, and being able to quickly resolve and mitigate the issue as fast as possible, right? So having knowing what machines you have, knowing what language they run, what package they have, what dependencies they have, what versions of dependencies, all of this will help you quickly be able to address and mitigate and patch your services. And yeah, that should be, I feel that should be the right approach, rather than trying to prevent an incident like this altogether. But yeah, so now we go to the bonus content. It's not really relevant to Log4j. It's kind of relevant, but it's more like about like a researcher and the company is working for, and how they behave in this whole incident. But basically, sometime in, I think, end of December, this researcher made a tweet on Twitter, and this was all he posted, right? Stay tuned for a blog post, and then in the image he provided, he kind of teased about a possible RCE that affected the latest version of Log4j. So this was apparently a version that already patched all the issues: the first vulnerability, the second vulnerability, the third vulnerability. And now he's claiming that there is an RCE that affects this new version, right? And this is like 18 days after the first CVE, right? So everybody's already tired of this incident. We are all like have been trying to work on this for a while now. We are all tired of this. But then here, this guy's claiming there is a new RCE. So all of us are like scrambling again, jumping in the meetings, trying to understand like what's this new vulnerability, how do we mitigate it, what's the impact here, right? And then the company he works for, come out and make a blog post, right, that claims that this new vulnerability is as critical as the original one. So then again, we are rushing, we're trying to understand what's wrong and everything. And then eventually this guy comes out and say, hey, it's not an RCE. It's actually just an arbitrary code execution, right? So some of you might ask, what's the difference? One is remote, one is arbitrary. Like, what's the real difference here, right? So I think we can kind of like understand the difference by looking at the vulnerability, like this particular vulnerability, and how to exploit it. But basically, the exploitation for this vulnerability it requires you to be able to control the configuration for the logging, or rather logging properties or configuration on the server side, and being able to add like a malicious ldap URL into it, right? So one, you need control of configuration, right? And two, you need to do it without anyone finding out that you make a request, or like you added some configuration that is pointing to some malicious URL, right? And so knowing this, like, if you think about it, like, this is not all that impactful, right? Like, this is not very exploitable. Like, a remote attacker will not be able to exploit this. And someone with access to your configuration probably already have access to your code, right? So really, how critical is this vulnerability? I personally don't think it's any critical at all, right? I don't think it's worth people rushing to try to fix this. So yeah, so the moral of story of that is really like, don't be an asshole, And I know many of you are students right now. When you go into the working life, don't spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Think about the many security teams out there that would suffer because of what you're trying to do here, right? Like just because of a moment of fame, how many people are staying up late because of that. But yeah, I guess with that I end my talk, and if anybody have any questions, now's the time. Well, I certainly spent many nights. I think I didn't sleep the first night, and probably the few nights after. So yeah. But I think it was fun. We kind of activated the entire company back to remediate patch their services. It was like a moment of rallying. Everybody was very united. It was actually very fun. I don't know if fun's the right word to say, but it was interesting. For many of us, it was probably the biggest incident ever. If you think back, there's not many vulnerabilities that are like this critical, right? If you think about wormable vulnerabilities, like maybe what was the Millennium Worm vulnerability? But I mean, like if you look at the older vulnerabilities that are wormable, a lot of them are like at a time where people don't really care about security. Companies don't have security teams, so it wasn't as crazy as something like this. To Terry's question, so you mentioned the invisibility of reviewing code for all dependencies, but what about reviewing dependencies for complexity in their design? Yeah, I agree. There's really no reason for Log4j to be so complex. I think it's one thing to review a dependency that is new to a code base, and it's another thing to continually review them every time they're being updated. And I think something like Log4j, probably didn't start up to be so complex, right? It's probably at the start, it was a very simple logging library, and over time it kind of grew in complexity to the monstrosity that it is today. The lookup feature is insanely flexible, right? There's really no reason why it should be like that. But yeah, it really is quite difficult to try to review everything that runs in production, even if you're just looking at design. It's something we try to do, but it's something that always slips, really easily. To Sean's question, did this vulnerability affect ops production at Snapchat? I don't know if I can answer this. But we definitely reacted really quickly. I think we were ahead of everyone when it comes to this. So any kind of impact is very minimal. Yeah, but you'll be surprised, right? Like we are not a huge Java shop, right? We are pretty young as a company. We don't use a lot of Java, but even then, there is still a lot of things that run Java, right? Like I believe Jira uses Java in the backend, and it could be like some software service that you're hosting that uses Java that is still in your network that you have to care for. So it's really hard to avoid Java entirely. And I don't think it's Java that is at fault here.